I was 73 years old the autumn my granddaughter set a photograph on the kitchen table and asked me who the woman in it was. The picture was old, edges soft as worn leather, and in it stood a young woman beside a dairy cow, her sleeves rolled to the elbow, her expression neither proud nor embarrassed, simply present, the way a good fence post is present, steady, belonging exactly where it stood. I held that photograph a long while before I answered. I told her it was a story I had not spoken aloud in many years, and that if she wanted to hear it properly, she would have to sit down and not rush me. She sat. She is a patient girl, my granddaughter, which I have always believed she inherited from her grandmother's side of the family and not from mine. So I went back to the summer of 1904, back to the high grass country of eastern Colorado, where the sky runs so wide and flat you can watch a storm building for 2 full days before it arrives. Back to a young man of 28 who believed, with the particular confidence of the young and wealthy, that he understood exactly what his life would look like. That young man was me. My father had built the Whitmore Ranch from almost nothing, a quarter section of dry grass range that he watered with stubbornness and hard work until it sprawled across 3,000 acres and carried a herd that turned heads at the county auction every September. He had died the previous winter, leaving it all to me, the land, the debt he had not mentioned in his will, and the expectation of every banker, neighbor, and county commissioner between here and Pueblo that Charles Whitmore's son would carry the name forward without stumbling. I was determined not to stumble. What I was less determined about, and far less honest with myself about, was how close to the edge I already stood. The winter had been cruel to the herd. We had lost 11 head to a cold snap that came early and stayed late, and the south pasture fence had gone 3 seasons without proper mending. The ranch hands who had worked for my father knew their business, but they also knew mine. They had seen the ledger book when my father died. They had seen my face when the lawyer read the figures aloud. I needed the county to believe the Whitmore Ranch was sound. I decided the surest way to do that was to marry well, and to marry publicly, and to do it before the summer social season ended, and the gossips had nothing left to discuss but my finances. The woman I had chosen, or rather, had arranged through a correspondence that felt more like a business negotiation than a courtship, was coming by train from St. Louis. Her family was respectable. Her manners were understood to be excellent. She had been educated at a proper school and could speak knowledgeably about music and current literature. What I had not asked about, what had not seemed remotely relevant to any plan I was making, was what she knew about cattle. I found out the answer to that question on the very afternoon she arrived, in front of half the county, in a way I was not prepared for and have never quite forgotten. Her train arrived at 2:30 in the afternoon, and I was there on the platform with my best hat and a borrowed buggy, polished to a shine that cost my stable hand an entire morning. I had invited the Hargrove family, the Deacons, and old Judge Peterson to ride out to the ranch afterward for a welcoming supper. That had been my plan. Arrive in style, present my bride, let the county see that Charles Whitmore was a man whose affairs were in fine order, and whose household was about to become even finer. She stepped off the train, and I will say this plainly, she was not what I had pictured. I had assembled in my mind a kind of decorative woman, the sort you see painted on the covers of ladies' magazines. Soft hands, pale complexion, a hat with too many flowers on it, What came down those steps was a woman of quiet, compact confidence. She was not small, not large. She moved like someone who had learned early that the ground beneath her feet was hers to claim. Her dress was respectable, but not extravagant. She carried her own bag. She shook my hand before I could offer my arm. I remember thinking, well, this is different. The drive out to the ranch took 40 minutes, and she spent most of it looking at the land. Not politely, the way guests do when they are trying to find something complimentary to say about scenery. She looked at it the way a man looks at a fence line he is measuring, carefully, deliberately, noting things. I caught her eyes moving across the pasture to the south, and I saw something flicker in her expression when she spotted the dairy herd standing bunched near the gate. She said nothing. I talked about the house, the social plans, the supper guests already assembled on my front porch. Those guests were the trouble. They had arrived early, the way people do when they are curious rather than polite, and they were milling about the yard with their glasses of lemonade when we pulled up. I helped her down from the buggy. I began the introductions. Judge Peterson was saying something gracious, and Mrs. Hargrove was leaning forward with that sharp interest she applies to everything she intends to report back to her circle. And then my new bride simply stopped responding to the introductions. She had heard something. I heard it too, a moment later. One of the cows was lowing in a low, insistent way that meant she was uncomfortable and had been for some time. My dairyman had taken ill that morning, and I had not yet found anyone to cover the afternoon milking. I had, in the press of preparation, let that detail slide. She handed me her bag, not dramatically, not with any speech attached to it. She simply placed the handle in my grip and walked, still in her traveling dress, still with the dust of the train on her shoulders. Directly past Judge Peterson, directly past Mrs. Hargrove's astonished face, through the gate and into the pasture. I stood there holding her bag. The guests turned and looked at me. I had no explanation to offer them. I was not entirely sure I had one to offer myself. She did not hurry. That was the thing that stayed with me longest when I turned the memory over in the years that followed. Any other woman, any woman with an audience watching and a reputation to either build or salvage, would have hurried, would have moved with apology in her steps, or with performance in them. She walked the way she had stepped down from the buggy, certain, unhurried, as though she had already made her calculations and found everything satisfactory. Judge Peterson cleared his throat. Mrs. Hargrove said something quiet to the woman beside her, and there was a small, polite laugh that was not polite at all. I kept my face composed, because a man in my position learns early that composure is the one currency that does not fluctuate with the season. But I felt the heat of it. I had arranged this gathering carefully, the flowers on the porch table, the cold, pressed cider, the careful way I had positioned everything so that the house showed its best angle in the afternoon light. And here was my bride, walking into a pasture. She found the stool without looking for it. It was hung on the fence post just inside the gate, where my dairyman had always kept it, and she took it down without breaking stride. She set it between the two cows with a steadiness that suggested she had done this in worse conditions than a watched pasture on a warm Colorado afternoon. She spoke to the animals. I could not hear the words from where I stood, but I saw the shift in both cows, the way the tension left their flanks. the way they resettled their weight. Animals know a calm hand before it touches them. She had not touched them yet. Then she did, and she milked them both, one on either side, with the kind of rhythm that is not learned in a season. That is learned in a childhood. That is learned so deep it lives in the muscle and the bone, and does not ask permission from the conscious mind before it begins. I became aware that the guests had drifted, almost without intending to, toward the fence. Not to mock exactly, or not only to mock. There was something in the watching of it that made mockery seem like the wrong instrument. Mrs. Hargrove had her hand on the top rail. Judge Peterson had his thumbs in his vest pockets and his head tilted at an angle I associated with him, working through a difficult question of law. I walked to the fence myself. I still had her bag in my hand, the bucket filled. The sound of it changed as the milk rose. That thin ringing against metal going fuller, going softer, going almost musical. The cows stood without complaint. She did not look up at the gathered faces along the fence line. She had not, I would come to understand, looked up at gathered faces along fence lines her entire life. She had simply worked through them, past them, beneath their notice or above their opinion, depending on which way you were inclined to look at it. My dairyman was a large man and a capable one. He milked one cow at a time, and he was efficient at it. She was doing both simultaneously, and she was not rushing. I noticed Judge Peterson had stopped smiling. She finished the near cow first, stripped her clean and proper. None of that hurried last pull that leaves milk behind and sours the udder over time. My dairyman had that bad habit, and I had never known enough to name it until I watched someone do the thing correctly. She moved the bucket part way, repositioned herself on the stool without standing, and gave the second cow the same deliberate, unhurried attention. Every motion had a logic to it that I could follow even without understanding the craft behind it. The guests at the fence had gone quiet in a way that was different from the quiet of before. The earlier quiet had been the held breath before laughter. This was something else. The quiet of people revising an opinion they had already spoken aloud, which is an uncomfortable thing to do in company, and so they did it silently. Mrs. Hargrove said something low to her husband. I did not hear the words. I saw him nod once. She lifted the full bucket clear and stood in a single motion, no bracing of the knees, no hesitation. She was not a large woman. The bucket was not a small one. She carried it the way women on working farms carry things, not because it is easy, but because it is necessary, and the distinction between those two conditions has long since ceased to matter. She came to the gate, and I opened it. I was still holding her traveling bag. I had been holding it this entire time, and I had not noticed, which tells you something about the quality of my attention in those minutes. She looked at me then, directly, which she had not done since the road, and her expression was not triumphant. That is the thing I want to make plain. A woman performing for an audience has a particular quality about her, a kind of bright edge, a consciousness of being seen. She had none of that. She simply looked at me the way a person looks at someone they are about to have a practical conversation with. She said the near cow had a tendency in the left hind quarter that wanted watching. She said it in plain terms, the way you say a fence post is loose or a wheel wants grease, not unkindly but without decoration. I said I would tell my dairyman. She said she would tell him herself, if I had no objection, because it was the sort of thing better demonstrated than described. I said I had no objection, and that was our first real conversation. Standing at a gate in the afternoon light with a full milk bucket between us and a dozen county guests arranged along my fence, pretending they had not just been caught laughing. Judge Peterson cleared his throat and said something about the heat. Someone agreed with him. The group began in a slow and dignified way to disperse back toward the house, as groups will when the thing they gathered to watch has ceased to be what they expected. I took the bag in one hand. I offered to carry the bucket with the other. She looked at the bucket, then at me, with an assessment in her eyes that I would come to know well. The look of a woman calculating whether a man can be trusted with a particular weight. She let me have it. That bucket was heavier than I let on. I had not done much carrying of milk pails in recent years. That was dairyman's work, or hired hand work, or in my father's day, my own boyhood work. And I was out of practice with the particular pull of it, the way the wire handle bites, the way you must hold yourself slightly off level to keep from sloshing. She walked beside me and did not look at me struggling and did not look away diplomatically either. She simply walked at a pace that made the struggle manageable, as though she had not noticed and was not noticing. That I would also come to know well. We walked to the dairy barn rather than the house. I had assumed we were walking to the house. I adjusted without comment, which I think was the right decision, because she was already talking. Quietly, steadily, the way she had milked, with a kind of unhurried efficiency, about the cows. She named them both. The names were not what I had called them, which had been number designations painted on a board by the stall doors, a system my dairyman favored. She had learned their names, she explained, from one of the younger hands, a boy of 15 who had given them names in the first week, and been gently discouraged from using them by my headman. She used them now without apology. She told me that one of the cows, the older of the two she had milked, was being underfed by approximately a quarter of what she needed, and that this was the reason her yield had been dropping, not any sickness, which was apparently what my dairyman believed. She said this without accusation toward my dairyman. She said he was likely working from what he knew, and what he knew was beef cattle and dairy cows were a somewhat different matter. She said she had worked dairy cows since she was old enough to carry a pail. She said she would be glad to speak with him about it, if I preferred. Or she could simply see to the feeding adjustment herself and say nothing, if that would cause less difficulty. I set the pail down inside the barn door. I stood in the dim and smelled the good clean smell of hay and animal warmth and old wood, and I thought about difficulty. The honest answer was that I did not know what would cause less difficulty. I had managed this ranch on paper, on account books, on the strength of men I paid to know what I did not. That had seemed sufficient. It had seemed, in fact, like the natural order of a certain kind of landowner's life. You did not need to know everything. You needed to know whom to trust to know it. But something in the way she had said dairy cows are a somewhat different matter made me aware, quietly and without drama, that I had trusted the wrong man with the wrong animals, and that the drop in yield I had attributed to the poor summer grass was something simpler and more correctable than I had understood. I told her to speak with my dairyman directly. She nodded once, already moving toward the feed bins with a practiced eye. already measuring distances with her gaze, and I stood with my hands empty in the doorway of my own barn, feeling something I could not yet name. That feeling stayed with me through the rest of that morning and into the afternoon, like a stone in a boot you do not stop to address, because you tell yourself you will address it later, and then later becomes evening, and evening becomes a habit of discomfort you have stopped noticing. I went back to the house. I sat at my desk in the office where my father's portrait watched me from above the fireplace. That particular expression he wore in all his portraits, the one that managed to be both proud and disappointed simultaneously, which I had always assumed was the painter's limitation and now began to suspect was accurate. And I opened the account books. Not the household ledger, the dairy ledger. I had not opened it in 11 months. The numbers were not a surprise exactly. They were more like a confirmation of something I had been allowing myself not to look at directly. The way you do not look directly at the sun even when you know perfectly well where it sits in the sky. The yield numbers fell in a clean, steady decline beginning in March of the previous year. My dairyman had noted nothing unusual. He had recorded the numbers and moved on, which was either professional detachment or something worse, and I was beginning to understand which. I heard her voice in the yard below the window. She was speaking with him, with my dairyman, and I did not open the window to listen because something told me that would be the wrong instinct. Whatever was being said needed to be said without me standing above it like a judge who had not yet earned that authority. I had spent enough of my life assuming the authority of my position translated automatically into the authority of my judgment. The dairy numbers disagreed. What I did instead was count. I counted the cows by name in the ledger. They all had names. My father had insisted on that. Said a cow with a name gave better. And I counted the recorded yields against what the breed should reasonably produce in a season. And by the time I had finished, the afternoon light had gone amber and long across the floorboards, and I knew, with the certainty of arithmetic, that we had been losing somewhere between a third and a half of potential yield for the better part of a year. She knocked at the office door just before supper. She came in when I said to come in, and she stood with her hands quiet at her sides, which I had already begun to recognize as her natural posture when she had something considered to say. She told me the cows were not being dried off properly between lactation cycles. She explained what that meant, with the same patience she might have used, explaining rain to someone who had never stood outside. She told me that 2 of the youngest cows had never been properly conditioned to the milking schedule and were resisting out of confusion rather than poor breeding. She said all of this without one word of blame, without the faintest inflection of, "I told you so," and I found that the absence of blame was somehow harder to sit with than blame would have been. I asked her what could be done. She said quite a lot, actually, if we began within the week. We began within the week. I will not pretend I understood everything she set in motion during those early days of November, when the frost came in before dawn and stayed until almost noon. What I understood was that she rose earlier than anyone on the property, that she moved through the barn with a lantern in one hand and a small ledger she had fashioned from folded paper in the other, and that by the time my foreman came in for his coffee, she had already logged observations about each cow that would have taken him the better part of an afternoon to compile. She reorganized the milking rotation entirely, Two of the younger cows she separated out and handled herself, alone, for the first 9 days, working to establish what she called a reliable rhythm between animal and hand. She spoke to those animals the way a patient school teacher speaks to a child who has been placed in the wrong grade, not with frustration, but with a kind of steady reassurance that things would make sense presently. I watched from the barn door one morning, not wanting her to know I was watching. She had her forehead resting gently against the flank of the more difficult one, a young roan we had nearly given up on. She was not doing anything dramatic. She was simply being still with the animal. And the animal was still in return. Within 2 weeks, that cow's yield had doubled. I brought the ledger numbers to supper one evening and set them on the table without comment. She looked at them, nodded once as though confirming something she had already known, and passed me the biscuits. That was the entirety of her celebration. I found myself wanting her to say more, wanting, if I am honest, for her to acknowledge that I had noticed, that I was paying attention, that I was no longer the dismissive man who had stood in that front yard while guests laughed. But she did not need my acknowledgement, and I think that was the thing that unsettled me most about her. She was not performing competence for my benefit. She simply was competent, the way the river is simply wet. The cheese had begun in earnest by then. She had converted the old spring house beside the east fence into what she called her workroom, though it looked to me more like a laboratory than any room I had word for. Wheels of pressing cheese wrapped in clean cloth, small crocks of cultured cream at various stages, a hand-drawn chart on the wall tracking temperature, days, and turning schedule with the precision of a railway timetable. She had written to a contact in the city, a woman she knew through correspondence, and had already arranged a trial order with a grocer 2 towns east who was willing to pay a fair price for aged product through the winter months. I had known nothing of this arrangement. She had simply made it. When I asked why she hadn't consulted me first, she looked at me with an expression that was not quite amusement and not quite patience, but something sitting quietly between the two. She said she had not wanted to raise my hopes until she had something certain to report. She said she preferred to bring answers rather than possibilities. I sat with that for a long time afterward. That answer she gave me, about bringing answers rather than possibilities, worked on me like water working on stone, slow and quiet and unavoidable. I had spent my whole life raising hopes before I had anything to show for them. My father had done the same. He would announce plans at the supper table with the conviction of a man who had already accomplished them. New pasture land, expanded breeding, stock, a second well. And then we would all wait to see which ones dissolved, and which ones, by some combination of luck and stubbornness, found their way to ground. I had inherited that habit without ever examining it. I talked about what I intended. She did what she intended, and then she told me about it. The first delivery went out on a Thursday in late October. I watched the wagon load up, 12 wheels of aged cheese wrapped in muslin, 18 crocks of cultured butter packed in sawdust for cold keeping, and 6 small rounds of a softer variety she had pressed only 4 days before, meant to sell quickly rather than age. She had labeled each crate in her careful, slanted hand with the ranch name and the contents and the date of production. She had thought to put the ranch name on them. I had not thought of that. I watched that wagon pull out of the yard, and I felt something I was not prepared to feel, which was the particular unease of a man who realizes he has been useful to someone else's plan rather than the center of it. It was not a bad feeling exactly, but it required adjustment. She was already back at the spring house before the wagon had cleared the fence line. I stood in the yard for a moment longer than I needed to, watching the dust settle, and then I went to find her. She was recording the outgoing inventory on her wall chart, adding a new column in a different color of chalk. She did not look up when I came in, but she spoke. She said the second grocer, the one in the county seat, had sent a letter of inquiry 2 days prior. She had not yet replied because she wanted to see how the first delivery was received before she committed to a second relationship. She said this the way a businesswoman might say it, which was precisely what she was. I asked her what she needed from me. She set down her chalk and looked at me then. She said she needed 2 things. The first was a second press. The one she had was managing, but it was limiting her volume. The second was my patience with the 4 new heifers she wanted to fold into the milking rotation by spring, which would require early handling through the winter months, and she could not do that and manage the spring house both. She was asking me to milk cows. I, who had not personally milked a cow since the age of 14, whose hands had spent the last decade signing documents and shaking hands at cattlemen's dinners. I said I would think on it. She said she understood that and went back to her chart. I thought on it for approximately 1 evening. The next morning I was in the barn before first light. I will not pretend it was graceful. My hands had forgotten the rhythm entirely, and the first heifer, a heavy-shouldered roan we had only recently acquired, had no patience for my fumbling. She stepped sideways twice and knocked the pail clean over once, and I sat there on that 3-legged stool in the cold gray dark, feeling every inch the fool I had been for a decade of cattlemen's dinners. But I kept at it. There is a stubbornness in me that has caused trouble in certain quarters and served me well in others, and that morning it served me. She found me on the 3rd morning, still at it before sunrise, and she did not say anything that could be taken as encouragement or pity. She simply sat down on the low bench near the door with a cup of coffee. She had brought 2, and watched. After a while, she said I was holding my wrists at the wrong angle, and she showed me the correction without taking over, which I appreciated more than I could have said at the time. The roan settled. The milk came easier. We sat there in the lantern-lit quiet of the barn with steam rising off the pail and frost on the window glass, and I thought that this was not the life I had imagined for myself at 34 years old. And yet it did not feel diminished. The second press arrived from the mill by wagon in the 2nd week of November. I had written to a man I knew in the county seat who owed me a moderate favor, and he had located the equipment and arranged the freight, and when the wagon came up the road, she was already in the doorway of the spring house, with her sleeves rolled and her expression entirely focused. The 2 hired men helped carry it in. She directed the placement the way a foreman directs the hanging of a gate, with authority and without waste of words. By evening it was seated and leveled, and she had already run a trial batch through it to test the pressure. That same week, the first letter of confirmed order came back from the grocer in the county seat. He wanted 12 pounds of butter per week through the winter months, and had inquired about hard cheese if she could manage it by January. She showed me the letter across the supper table and did not say "I told you so," which she would have been entitled to say. She simply asked if I thought she should accept. I said I thought she should. She folded the letter and set it beside her plate and said she would reply in the morning. I watched her across that table in the lamplight. The steadiness of her, the way she moved through problems as though problems were simply the texture of a day and not occasions for alarm. And I understood something I had been slow to understand. I had brought her here expecting very little. The county had expected even less. And she had gone about her work without waiting for our expectations to improve. I began to wonder what it might mean to stop expecting and simply see. I asked her to marry me in February, on a morning when the temperature had dropped so far that the breath of the cows hung in the barn like small clouds, and the water in the milking pail skinned over with ice between one pull and the next. I had not planned it for that morning particularly. I had simply been watching her work. The sure rhythm of her hands, the patient way she spoke to the animals as though they were worth addressing, and the words came out of me before I had arranged them into anything dignified. She did not answer right away. She finished the near side of the second cow, shifted the pail, and began again. I stood there in the cold and waited. After a while, she said she would want to think on it, and I said that was reasonable. She said she did not intend to be kept, that she would go on working the dairy operation as her own concern within whatever arrangement we made. And I said that was more than reasonable, that it was, in fact, the only arrangement that made any sense to me now. She looked up at me then, measuring something in my face. Whatever she found there appeared to satisfy her. She said she would have an answer for me by supper. She did. It was yes. We were married in April in the small church at the edge of town, the same town where the county men had stood in my yard and laughed. Several of them attended. They had stopped laughing some months before, round about the time word got out about the grocer's standing order and the trial arrangement with the hotel kitchen 2 towns over. Men have a way of revising their estimations when the ledger makes the argument for them. The Whitmore land did not fail. That is the plain fact of it. The grazing parcel I had been ready to sell stayed in the family. The house that had felt too large and too quiet for one man became a house where things were made and stored and traded out of. Butter crocks in the cellar, waxed rounds of cheese on the cool shelf, a correspondence with suppliers conducted from the kitchen table on winter evenings. She built that business the same way she built everything, methodically, without drama, one solved problem at a time. I think about those county men sometimes and their laughter in the yard. I think about how certain I was in the weeks before she arrived, that I understood what she was and what she was not. We are often most wrong about the things we have decided before looking. She walked past my grand house and sat down between my cows and showed me something I had not the wit to see without being shown. She is still here. We are both considerably older now and considerably less concerned with what the county thinks of us. The dairy is her domain and has been for 30 years. I have learned to stay out of her way in the barn, which she considers a significant improvement in my character, and which I consider the most useful education I ever received. I did not deserve her. I had sense enough, eventually, to stop acting as though that meant she wasn't mine.